Hello, everybody. We are going to talk through Unit 3 really quickly, and I'm going to move through this stuff pretty fast. I want to apologize in advance if my dog barks. He is very small and very needy. So, Unit 3 is all about land-based empires. So, that's like the Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, the Gunpowder empires, and then also like Russia, a little bit of France, China. These are the empires that trade mostly over land, expand over land, but don't do so much maritime travel. Unit 3 talks all about how they expand, legitimize, and consolidate their rule. I feel like this is stuff that we know really well, so I'm going to move fast, but I'm going to highlight what's important. So 3.1 is expansion. How did these land-based empires develop and expand in 1450 to 1750? A little bit of context that we all know is that the expansion of these land-based empires would not have been possible without the the fall of the Mongol Khanates. So the Khanates fall into civil war, they weaken, and that leaves a power vacuum for the Gunpowder empires, Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, and the Russian are also considered a Gunpowder empire, mostly the first three, the Islamic states, to expand and grow in this period. As a theme, the Gunpowder empires were highly militaristic, but they left great artistic and architectural legacies, and they legitimized their rules in a lot of different ways, but the primary one was the use of gunpowder to expand. We also see the Qing Empire in China, and then we see Europe grow and start to connect with the Americas. Belief systems, religion is obviously incredibly important at this time. We see huge Islamic powerful states in the Gunpowder empires, and their disagreements over how to practice Islam created some tensions. We also see trade move from something that is relatively peaceful to something that is protected with guns. So first, let's talk quickly about Europe. So we talked in the last unit about how Europe was pretty behind the times, especially after the plague. Well, in 1450, we start to see Europe come out of the Dark Ages or the medieval period and begin the early modern period. The plagues are over. 100-Year War in Europe, which was fought between European nations, had ended, and the printing press spread literacy throughout Europe. And as education becomes more prominent, typically, this is a global theme, you start to see advancements in technology, governing, politics, things like that. So new monarchies begin to grow throughout Europe, and they all centralize power by controlling taxes, centralizing the military, and controlling religion. That is something that you should really just commit to your memory, because that is a global theme. As governments centralize, they do so by controlling taxes, the military, and religion. That is pretty universal. We also see a big dispute start to grow throughout Europe between the power of the ruler and the power of the nobility. In Russia, Ivan IV becomes Tsar. He's Ivan the Terrible, and he wants to expand Russia eastward. He also wants to sort of solve the problem, is Russia more east or west? He takes control of the last Khanates that were held by descendants of the Golden Horde through the use of gunpowder. He also kills his son in a fit of rage. We see that painting here in the middle. And he focused a lot on expanding east to control fur. So Russia wants to control the fur trade. This is when we start to see the use of the Cossacks, who are fierce warriors. They were escaped serfs to help expand into Siberia. He wanted to take control of the Volga River, which was important because it allowed Russia to trade with the Ottoman Empire. So again, the important thing about Europe is that these new monarchies start to grow. They control taxes, military, and the religion. And then Russia starts to expand eastward, and they dominate the fur trade and convert mostly to Eastern Orthodoxy. Now let's talk a little bit about East Asia. And again, sorry, I'm going really quickly, but I want to hit the highlights. So we have the Yuan dynasty, which was the Mongol dynasty. It's overthrown by the Ming, and the Ming stabilized power for over 300 years. They are one of the longest, not one of the longest, but they're one of the more prosperous dynasties in China. And if you look here in this column, we see some Ming rulers. They are eventually overthrown by the Manchu. They were foreigners, people from Manchuria. That is something to write down. The Manchu Empire was similar to the Mongol Empire in that they were both foreign rulers, foreign ethnic groups coming into China to establish rule. So some prominent rulers in the Ming were Emperor Kangxi, one of China's longest rulers. He expands China into Taiwan. Um, he imposes a protectorate over Tibet and northern India, and we still see Chinese influence and power in that region today. So he expands the empire. It's a very peaceful time. Then we have Emperor Qinlong, came into power at a time when the Chinese bureaucracy was very efficient as it had been, tracing back all the way to Song China. Some of that bureaucracy fell out during the Mongol time period, but they really bring it back. He very violently expanded Chinese borders. There are some ethnic conflicts that still exist in that region today that trace all the way back to this time. He put the Dalai Lama in Tibet and spent a lot of money trying to move into Tibet and Burma, which really emptied China's treasury. Overall, these expansions were incredibly successful. So we see Kangxi expands the empire in a very peaceful way, really increases the influence of China, and then Qianlong comes in, tries to continue that expansion, spends a lot of money, puts China over here into some financial troubles. So China is starting to close itself off from trade at this time, and we'll talk more about that later. But he does give trading rights to some Europeans because he knew that there were certain things Europe had that China needed. He didn't want to trade frivolous stuff, but he felt like trade had to exist in some capacity. But Britain was not happy about this. You know, we're going to talk about how all Europe wanted was the goods that existed in Asia, and they wanted more than Qianlong was going to give. So eventually, he kind of tells King George to get lost and really injures that trade relationship. So again, the usually very efficient bureaucracy, think back to Song China and how their bureaucracy was so big and strong, becomes corrupt. They continue to levy very heavy taxes, and as a result, we see a resurgence of the White Lotus Society, which is the same society that had tried to overthrow the Mongols and install the Ming. They come back and try to reestablish the Ming dynasty, get rid of the Manchu foreigners, but the government suppresses it, and over 100,000 peasants are killed. So right now, China is closing off. They're kind of struggling with the expansion and their treasury and taxes, and the people aren't super happy. Over here, next we've got the Islamic gunpowder. So we're going to talk about how they expanded, basically through the military. It all started with Tamerlane, this guy who set up the first sort of gunpowder empire. It's Tamerlane's empire. You can see the map on the right. He existed around the time of the Mongol Khanates. He built his government solely dependent on the military. That is a theme that we will see go into these gunpowder empires. They relied heavily on the military, but he encouraged art and learning. It started in Samarkand, which you should remember from the Silk Road, was a trading city, and began this Ghazi ideal, which has influenced Muslim warrior class cultures for a long time, and it created a huge amount of loyalty to the state. So he expanded rapidly, very quickly out of Samarkand, but he didn't set up a ruler to come after him. So there was ineffective rule, which sort of ended Tamerlane's empire. But it's significant because it established all of these traditions that gunpowder empires carried on. Now let's talk about the Ottoman Empire, which is one of the longest existing empires in the history of the world. So it used gunpowder to establish itself. It was the largest and most enduring of these Islamic gunpowder empires. This is very significant. Write this down. The location of the Ottoman Empire was highly significant because it gave them easy access to trade with Europe, Asia, and Africa, and of course the Middle East. So Mehmed II is called the Conqueror. He sort of establishes the Ottoman Empire. He took siege weapons from Asia and Europe and used that to overthrow Constantinople and establish the Ottoman capital. Again, great location for trade. The Ottomans exist for so long in a lot of ways because of their location. He expanded to land around the Black Sea. He fought against Venice, which was a European nation, tried to expand that way, didn't quite get there, but did make Venice pay a yearly tax. This is scary to Europe They right now are fighting their own wars, and they don't want to deal with the Islamic gunpowder empires. So the fact that we see Mehmed II and later Suleiman I sort of knocking on the door of Europe makes them very nervous. So now we have Suleiman I. This is when the Ottoman Empire reaches its peak. He was again able to send troops all the way into Christian Europe and Vienna, which really puts Europe on high alert for a little while. Suleiman's army eventually conquers the Isle of Rhodes and Mediterranean, which had been held by Christian knights. Again, we start to see the Europeans start to freak out. He also expands into North Africa. So, with the Ottoman Empire, Mehmed II is the establisher. Suleiman I really expands it. We see this massive empire. You can see the map over here, covers parts of the Middle East, Europe, and Africa, has huge influence in this region for a long time. Getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but just to talk about the decline of the Ottoman Empire, it eventually turns into what is called the sick man of Europe, because it does exist into the 20th century in the 1900s. And there's just poor rule after Suleiman. They have a couple of really strong, great leaders, and then that sort of falls away. And we see the rise of harem politics, which is where the numerous wives of the sultans wanted their son to be king. And there was lots of treason and fighting between the different women in the harem to promote their son. And it just makes for a very chaotic, unorganized, empire with no real line of succession. So slowly nations become independent, and eventually as Great Britain and France get more powerful, we see World War I happen, the Ottoman Empire falls. Now let's talk Safavid. So the Safavid Empire had some very real drawbacks. They had no navy. Their geography wasn't great. They didn't have natural land barriers. You can see that they're right up next to some khanates. They're right up next to the Ottoman and Mughal Empire, but they had strong leaders and a very strong military. We see Shah Abbas I, who presided over the empire at the height. He impressed or stole Christian boys into his military. We will talk more about that later. That's also a theme in these gunpowder empires. He imported great weapons from Europe. He was an awesome leader. He took advice from other successful leaders in the time period and implemented those into his empire. And this is key. Write this down. In the Safavid Empire, he made everybody be Shia Islam. He used religion as a unifying force. The Ottomans were much more tolerant, much more lenient towards other religions, and that was kind of how they kept the peace. But if you were in the Safavid Empire, you had to be Shia Islam. He denied legitimacy to any other Sunni ruler. He imposed taxes on non-Muslims, and this led to a lot of tension with the Ottoman Empire. This tension between Sunni and Shia Islam still exists today in Iraq and Iran, and it can be traced back to this time. He also implemented trade bans, which bolstered the economy of the Safavids. The Ottomans used trade bans, which bolstered the economy of the Ottomans to hurt the Safavids and assert dominance. There's lots of tension between these two empires. Women in the Safavid Empire, there's not much about them, but it is important to note that we see they had some freedoms that the Ottoman women did not have, like inheritance or divorce. So again, jumping ahead a little bit, let's talk decline. They, again, theme had an ineffectual leaders. They spent a lot of money on the military, and they weren't really expanding much at the end of their empire, but the military had very lavish lifestyles. We start to see Sunni rebellions, and all of this comes together to really weaken the Safavid Empire. Eventually, Russia and the Ottomans seize this territory. It is replaced by the Zand dynasty, which is relatively small, and the Safavids lose influence in the region. Now, quickly, we're going to talk about Mughal. There's one thing, if there is one thing I want you to take from the Mughal Empire, it is that Akbar the Great established a lot of religious tolerance. The Mughal Empire is in India. It was established by Babur, who was a descendant of Tamerlane. His grandson, Akbar the Great, is known as one of the great leaders of all time. It is one of the richest and best governed states in the world at the time. They traded overseas a bit, like textiles, spices, precious stones. They got back gold and silver, so they were pretty wealthy. The Indian caste system, which you can see outlined in the pyramid to the right, controlled society very strictly. But we do see a lot of religious tolerance. The Mughal Empire was known, like Russia, for overland expansion. So they expanded across land. That is a theme we see with these gunpowder empires. And of course, architecture, which we're going to talk about later on. So the big decline, the problem with the Mughal Empire is that they failed to keep up with the military growth and modernization that the other empires at the time were achieving. And they were weakened by external forces. Tensions between Hindus and Muslims continued to grow despite the prevalence of religious freedom, and it just led to some instability, which allowed the French and eventually the British to come in and assert dominance in India. We see the British eventually have a dominion over India for quite a while after the fall of the Mughal Empire. So 3.2 is all about administration. We've talked about how they were established, gunpowder, strong leaders who were very effective, unifying forces like religion or religious tolerance. And now let's talk about how they ran these empires. How did rulers in these empires legitimize and consolidate their rule? In England and throughout, but really in England at the time, we see the divine right of the king become very prominent. In France and with King James I. To disobey the king also means to disobey God. This is much like the Chinese system back in Song China, and it makes the king the head of not only the government, but the church. And remember, the Catholic Church in Europe at the time is the strongest institution in Europe. We also see England use bureaucratic elites. I want you to make a chart somewhere if you're taking notes that is just about bureaucratic elites, because we're going to see this all over the place. The English used the justice of the peace, who had the power to collect taxes. It weakened the feudal system and made the king stronger. Remember, the feudal system is where people lived on lord's land for protection, and they paid taxes to the lord of the land. Now they're paying taxes to the king instead, so that feudal system gets weaker. There are some checks to power in England, however. We see Parliament, which shares power with the king and grows in power after things like the Magna Carta. And then I want you to put a star, write this down somewhere. The English Bill of Rights is signed. This ensures individual civil liberties to English citizens. So it takes the king from someone who is all powerful and says, hey, the king is mostly all powerful, but there are certain things he can't do. It's kind of like unalienable rights in the American Constitution. Let's look at France now. We have Henry IV and Louis XIV, some of the biggest characters in history. They also believed in the divine right of the king, and they believed that they should have absolute power, combining all processes of law in one person. So no parliament, nothing like that. King gets to make all the decisions. Louis, in fact, said, I am the state. So he believed that without him, the French Empire would not exist. They also used bureaucratic elites, write this in your chart if you're doing that, called intendants or tax farmers. They functioned very similarly to the justice of the peace, and they collected taxes. They went out and farmed for money. Louis XIV built the Palace of Versailles to keep the nobles close, to show how rich he was, and to ensure their loyalty. Because if they're only partying at Versailles, they're not going out and about talking to each other privately, they're going to stay loyal to King Louis. Eventually, over time, we start to see England give more and more power to the people, and I'm talking over, centuries. France fails to do this for a long time, and that eventually ends up in the French Revolution in the 1800s. Or 1700s, excuse me. France is weakened by its inability to share power. Now let's talk about Russia and how they centralized control. Russia had very strict social classes, and this exists for quite a while. The boyars, who were rich people who own land, landed aristocracy is what they're called, are at the top, and the serfs are at the bottom. Interestingly enough, the highest taxed people in Russia are the serfs, who are the poorest people, and that is how they kept the peasant population under control. Ivan IV hated the boyars because he didn't want them to challenge his power. We see that all throughout history. Just like Louis XIV didn't want his nobility challenging him, Ivan IV felt the same about the boyars. He went so far as to make all boyar families live in Moscow, and he created the Oprichnina, which is a secret police that was highly loyal to Ivan, and they sort of kept an eye on the boyars, made sure the boyars weren't doing anything funky. We then see in Russia Peter the Great, who had to consolidate his empire by defeating his sister and her army of boyars called the Streltsky. He took control after Ivan after defeating the Streltsky army, sending his sister off to a convent, and essentially just eliminating any threat that came his way. That's how the Russians consolidated power. Gunpowder, totalitarian control over their people. He also reorganized Russia into provinces. He used bureaucratic elites like tax farmers or intendants to collect taxes, and he created a Senate to inform his decisions. So at this point in history, Russia is even sharing power better than France is. Down here we have a map of the Russian Empire and some important buildings established. Hold on, I'm about to sneeze maybe. Nope, it went away. Now let's talk how the Ottomans centralized control. And again, moving very fast, a lot of these things, though, are the same. For example, we see the devshirme system. This is where boys are taken, Christian boys are taken, and they are put into the military. They are taken at a young age, so they are able to be really molded in this Ottoman system. The Ottomans took Christians because they were not people of the book, so Muslims or Jews. They were taught skills in politics, art, the military. They received high levels of education, high-profile jobs. A lot of people wanted their sons to be taken and put into this system because they knew that the opportunity and the ability for upward mobility was much higher if they were a devshirme or a janissary than it would be otherwise. The janissaries are elite. They are fiercely loyal to the Sultan. They provided a path to upward mobility, and this is key. Write this down somewhere. They were a very interesting system because they were not ethnically Ottoman. They were taken from elsewhere. So they really brought a lot of cultural influence into the Ottoman Empire and had a very powerful place. We'll see the Janissaries will eventually become a little more powerful than even the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire. Let's talk China and the Mughal Empire. So under the Ming Dynasty, they consolidated control by basically erasing everything that the Mongol rulers had done under the Yuan Dynasty. They brought back the civil service exam, which traces all the way back to Song China. They improved education, made a free national school system, and reestablished that strong Chinese bureaucracy. Now, if you remember back to 3.1, eventually that bureaucracy becomes corrupt. But the Ming Dynasty reestablished it, and that's how they consolidated rule after the Mongol Dynasty. The Qin Dynasty, again, that effective bureaucracy becomes corrupt. They levied high taxes on the people. They used taxes as a way to control the populace. That eventually backfires, and had very harsh military control to retain authority over their people. Again, in Mughal India, under Akbar, he created a very strong centralized government. He was such a great leader that people came from all over the world all over the region to work for Akbar because his reputation was so great. He created very fair law systems that could be appealed. People had a little bit of a voice in the government. And he used, again, keyword, bureaucratic elites, the zamindars, to execute duties like collecting taxes. So the zamindars were paid. Not all bureaucratic elites were paid. The zamindars were, the intendants in France were, and they were paid by keeping a portion of the taxes that they collected for the king. Now, after Akbar left, he was such a strong leader, people were so loyal to him, nobody wanted to sort of screw him over. But he left, the zamindars become corrupt, they start to challenge the power of the Mughal Empire, and they even went so far as some of them built armies that were loyal just to them. And they could do this because they skimmed a little bit off the top when they were supposed to be collecting taxes. So the bureaucratic elites was one way that governments were centralized, but in some cases they kind of backfired. So that is the Chinese and the Mughal. So again, we see these themes of using bureaucratic elites, strong centralized governments, harsh military control to control, consolidate, and legitimize rule. Now let's talk Japan. Japan is a little bit of an interesting one. So Japan was ruled by military leaders called shoguns. This is before Japan was unified. And they were in constant conflict with the daimyo, who were the land-holding aristocrats. So they were like the Russian boyar or the French nobles. They were rich people that owned land, and they constantly fought with the shoguns. Each daimyo had an army of samurai that were loyal only to him, and that obviously makes them very powerful. So, gunpowder, the increase of gunpowder, allowed three daimyos to successively rule and come together to consolidate power in Japan. I'm not even going to try to say these names because I don't want to be offensive. The first one used gunpowder to unify a third of Japan. The next, Hideyoshi, followed the first and expanded until all of Japan is finally united. And then we start to see the Tokugawa shogunate. Ieyasu is the first one. He came after Hideyoshi, and his successors ruled Japan in the Tokugawa shogunate into the mid-19th century. It's called the period of great peace. So again, strong rulers, gunpowder, all come together to consolidate rule in Japan. The Tokugawa shogunate, which is just the name, it's like a dynasty name, they created centralized control. They ended the feudal system in Japan. It had already ended in Europe. And they ruled in a way that is very similar to what we see happen in Moscow and in France. They gave the daimyo some power. They're like the nobility, but they forced them to have two residents. This is a system, it's a ransom system. So essentially, if the daimyo was away from the capital, their family had to stay in the capital, so they would not try to pull a fast one on the ruler, the shogun. So that is how Japan consolidated power, control, gunpowder, centralized government, same deal. Now, I'm very quickly going to talk about art and architecture. This is a common theme that we see throughout. Europe uses the divine right of the monarchy. Places like the Palace of Versailles keep the nobles in check. Peter the Great built St. Petersburg. He moved the capital sort of west because he wanted to be more Western, built these beautiful monumental structures that showed his power. St. Petersburg was highly organized, one of the first great cities to be built on a grid. So it just looked and felt organized. It still does to this day. Kept the boyars close to keep an eye on them, built places like the Winter Palace, really tried to westernize, be more like Europe, to show the European powers that Russia was a power to be dealt with. Now let's talk about Songhai, which is in Africa. It was united by making Islam the united religion. We see the same thing in the Safavid Empire with the use of Shia Islam. In the Mughal Empire, we see the building of massive structures like the Taj Mahal. This is significant, and I would write this down. We oftentimes see that art of one religion was combined with local arts to make a syncretic community and culture. So in the Mughal Empire, we see lots of buildings where the art of Islam is combined with local art, and it creates a syncretic system. And those structures still exist today. And of course, they all show the power of the emperor. In the Ottoman Empire, we have the Suleymaniye Mosque. It was built to show the power of the king. This is key. It built old and new traditions. So it combined a little bit of the old, a little bit of the new, made this new beautiful structure. We have the royal residence of the sultans, the Topkapi Palace, and they restored landmarks from the previous Constantinople, like the Cathedral of St. Sophia, which was I believe a Catholic cathedral, and then it was turned into a Muslim mosque. So again, that's sort of that syncretic design where they take a little bit of the old, a little bit of the new, put it together to make something. Now let's talk about how they used money to consolidate power. In Russia, we see that they start to privatize industry. They start to make public industry. So that is industry that is owned by the state. So the government makes industries like shipbuilding and iron mines to try and bring in more money, and they continue to heavily tax the serfs. Taxation is a huge theme. How do they get money to expand? Taxes. In the Ottoman and Mughal Empire, again, we see tax farming in the Zamindar system. The Ming taxed private citizens and families, and they taxed things. They collected taxes in the form of grain and later silver. We see the tribute system is a continuity throughout history. That's something that we've seen throughout different empires that we've learned about. China collected tribute from Korea. The Aztec Empire had numerous tribute nations, but they also taxed their citizens, so they had a lot of tax income. And then the Songhai Empire in Africa also collected tribute. So, how did they legitimize power through finances? They taxed people. That's basically it. Now let's talk beliefs. How did different belief systems endure or change during the period 1450 to 1750? So religion has always been an important force in empire building. Sometimes it is what unifies an empire, sometimes it is what divides it, sometimes it is what keeps nations together, sometimes it creates enemies. It was so important that we see a ruler as powerful as Henry IV of France convert or change his religion to try and solidify power. He was a Protestant, but he converted to Catholicism to try and keep his rule unified. The famous quote from Henry IV is like, well, France is worth a mass every now and then. So it was worth it to him to have to go to mass, even if he didn't believe it, in order to keep his empire together. The other important thing about this topic is the religious schisms or splits. So we have the Protestant Reformation, where Catholicism and Protestantism split, and the split in Islam between the Sunni and Shia. Quickly, let's talk Protestant Reformation. So basically, at the time in Europe, the Catholic Church was incredibly strong. Remember, during the Dark Ages, it was like the only thing that kept the Catholic Church together, that kept Europe together. So as the governments of Europe strengthen and feudalism falls, the Catholic Church starts to face some challenges. They had tried to make some changes that were unsuccessful. There was this thing called the Babylonian captivity, where the papacy was moved from Rome to France. Nobody really liked that. It gave French rulers too much power. People were getting more and more upset about that. And then when the Black Death spread, people were so religious at the time, they felt like it was the church's fault that so many people had died. So the Catholic Church at the beginning of this period is just really not in great shape. And we start to see the rise of people like John Wycliffe, who starts to express the belief that priests are not necessary for salvation. You don't have to go to church to be saved. He also translated the Bible into English, which is huge because it gave access to the Bible to more people than it had ever been given to before. So the average person now can consume the Bible. Around the same time, we start to see Martin Luther. He thought that the Catholic Church was corrupt. He disliked particularly the selling of indulgences where you could pay for your sins, simony, which bought church offices. He believed, like John Wycliffe, in sola fide, or faith alone, which means that I don't need to go to church to be saved. It is my relationship with Christ or whoever that allows me to be saved. He very dramatically posted his 95 Theses on the church door, which were basically the 95 things he said were wrong with the church. And with Martin Luther and Lutheranism, Protestantism is born. So under Christianity, there are two branches, Catholicism and Protestantism. And there are about 1 billion branches of Protestants. Lutheranism is one of them. We also see John Calvin break from the Catholic Church and establish Calvinism. He believed in plain living, simple buildings, governance by church officials. This picture up in the top right is to sort of signify he believed that there were the predestined, or those that were the elect were predestined to go to heaven. So you were born already either going to heaven or not. So sorry about it to the people that aren't. And he believed that God favored hard work, not word. First typo of the evening. I did not proofread this, so I'm sure there are more to come. So that is Calvinism. That eventually turns into Puritanism. They come to the New World, have very similar beliefs to Calvinism, but these are kind of the first leaders of the Reform movement. There's got to be a change. Then we have old Henry VIII over here, who sees all of these other reform movements going on, really wants a divorce from his wife, and decides to establish the Church of England, also known as Anglicanism, so he could be free from the power of the church and the Pope. That is kind of one way that he consolidated rule, because he doesn't want to deal with the Pope anymore. Now he can do whatever he wants. So again, these are the main movements of the Protestant Reformation, which is the break of Protestant religions from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church does not take this sitting down. They lead what is called the Counter-Reformation. they really did not want this Protestant movement to spread. So the first thing they do, there's three things. The first thing is they establish the Inquisition, which had been used for centuries to try and stop the spread of Islam. And they used it as a way to kind of investigate and punish non-believers. They were very violent. The Jesuits, which still exist today, undertook missionary activity in Spanish empires as well as Japan and India to try and spread Catholicism, because if we're losing Catholics to Protestantism, we need to get new Catholics in other parts of the world. And then the Council of Trent, which tried to correct some of the worst problems of the church. They banned Protestant books, and they reaffirmed some practices of the Catholic Church, like their communion and the way that they did marriages and things like that. So the three things were relatively successful. The Counter-Reformation does not stop the spread of Lutheranism or Protestantism, but it does keep Catholicism as the main religion in Western Europe and the Mediterranean region. Also, as Catholic nations begin to colonize, Catholicism spreads with it to the New World. So Catholicism does not lose influence or power. It just kind of now has to jockey for position with Protestantism. So Lutheranism did spread. It caused Charles V to leave the Holy Roman Empire, which is basically just Germany, because he was so ashamed that Lutheranism had moved into his empire, he just gave up. He abdicated. He felt like a failure. And part of the reason Lutheranism was so successful in Germany, and this is key, write this down somewhere, is because German nobles helped support the growth of Lutheranism in Germany. So some European nations were more supportive to Protestants than to Catholics, but for the most part, the people in charge stayed Catholic, so the official religion stayed Catholic, except for old Henry VIII, because he really needed to get a divorce. So that is the Counter-Reformation. We also see in this time period, 1450 to 1750, a lot of wars of religion. Religion really becomes one of the biggest causes of war, and I would say that religion, in a lot of ways, stays big causes of wars globally. So Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, and I put a map up here of the Holy Roman Empire because we haven't talked about it a lot, but again, it's basically like where Germany is. It grows in power for a little while, doesn't stick around for long, though. So Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire eventually, or before he abdicates, tries to fight these pesky German Lutherans. It ended in the Peace of Augsburg, which allowed every German state to choose if the ruler would be Catholic or Lutheran. So he loses some ground there, and he's not happy about it. In France, Catholics fought the Protestants, the Huguenots, which were a Protestant branch, for over 50 years. Long time. This is when Henry IV tried to become Catholic to unify the rule. He's like, whatever, I'll be Catholic if everybody will stop fighting. He issued the Edict of Nantes, which allowed Huguenots to practice their faith, but just the Huguenots, only them. This keeps the peace in France for about 87 years until some knucklehead comes along and takes away the edict, the revocation of the edict, and this really heavily negatively impacts France because people are just like, whatever, we'll just go somewhere where we can practice whatever religion we want, and a lot of skilled craftsmen leave France. The next big war is the 30 Years' War. This is a religious conflict that again started in the Holy Roman Empire, but it eventually kind of became something that wasn't based on religion. It really grew and became a conflict that involved a lot of European nations, and it devastated the European continent in a lot of places. This is not the first like world war because it didn't involve the whole world, but it involved a lot of nations. It resulted in widespread famine and disease, which is not ever fun. And it ended in the Peace of Westphalia, which allowed each region of the Holy Roman Empire to become Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist. This really provided a lot of these little states in the Holy Roman Empire to become more autonomous, and they started to raise armies, especially places like Prussia and Austria, and they began to assert themselves as independent nations. Again, we haven't talked about the Holy Roman Empire a lot, but this is kind of the beginning of the end for that place. So wars of religion really tear up Europe, and it's all sort of Catholicism versus Protestantism. Now let's talk about in the Gunpowder Empire, we see the Islamic religious split between Sunni and Shia. And essentially, the Sunni versus Shia rivalry is over who should be able to lead the community, who has authority, what birthright is. All Muslims have things in common, just like all Christians have things in common, but the Sunni versus Shia split historically has been a very violent disagreement. In the Ottoman Empire, Islam was the dominant religion. They used the Muslim Sharia law code to consolidate their rule, and most Ottomans were Sunni. There was some tolerance under Suleiman, but leaders after him did not continue on his path of tolerance. The Safavid Empire has always been dominated by Shia Islam. Rulers were heavily hostile towards Sunni Muslims, which again created lots of hostility between the Ottomans. It was mandatory in the Safavid Empire to be a Shia. And just to reiterate, Mughal consolidated and unified his empire by tolerating religions. Star, highlight, underline. You need to know that. You need to know all of it, but make sure you know that. He tried to make his own religion that blended Islam, Hinduism, and Sikhism, which he really heavily supported Sikhism because it was relatively peaceful, but it didn't work out. Finally, at this time period, another belief that is starting to crop up is the scientific revolution. And that is another reason why the Catholic Church wanes in power. Because in the 1600s, the way people think shifts. Scientific thinking, the ideas of the Renaissance, like curiosity, discovery, investigation, learning, the arts, all become more prominent in Europe. And they challenge the ideas of some of the religious thought at the time. So in a time where religions are already splitting, the scientific revolution, which really focuses more on rational thought than faith alone, an idea called empiricism, doesn't help the power of the church. Eventually, the scientific revolution leads to the Enlightenment, which we're going to talk about in the next unit. Okay, so that is it. That is Unit 3. Again, I went through that really fast. The big things to know are how these empires consolidated and legitimized their rule. The Mughals used religious harmony. The Ottoman Empire and other systems used tax farming. They used the zamindars, the janissary system, justice of the peace, things like that. Martin Luther led a reform movement against the church because he did not think the Pope was doing what he should be doing, thought they were corrupt. Protestants were helped in some European nations like Germany. And again, religion, art, architecture, tax collection, bureaucratic elites, those were all used to consolidate and legitimize rule. So yeah, that is that. If you have questions over Unit 3, please let me know.